She was 27 years old, and the only thing standing between her mother and a dialysis machine was a contract nobody had signed yet. Maeve Sullivan worked the client desk at a glass tower on West Wacker Drive in downtown Chicago. Hired through an agency at an hourly wage, almost a year in and 3 weeks away from the review that would finally make her permanent. She showed up before dawn every morning with her mother's soup in a dented steel thermos, and she kept her head down, because women like her didn't get second chances in buildings like that. On the 6th of November, a few minutes before 6 in the morning, a man came out of the emergency stairwell and into that spotless marble lobby. His work clothes were soaked through. There was dried blood across his palm, and he could barely hold himself upright. He asked for one person by name, and nobody in that room believed a word of it. To everyone standing there, he was just a night janitor who'd wandered somewhere he didn't belong. And the woman in the cobalt blue suit, the one whose smiling face was printed on the charity banner hanging right above her head, gave the order to put him out on the street. Maeve was the only one who moved. She knelt down on that floor, poured soup from her mother's thermos, and called an ambulance on her own phone. It cost her everything in under 4 minutes. Her badge was torn from her neck in front of every person she'd ever worked with. Her mother's soup went across the marble. By midnight, she'd been terminated and accused of stealing money she had never once touched. And then, as she was gathering her things up off the floor, the bleeding man lifted his head and asked her one question. "What is your full name?" Before this is over, that question is going to reach places nobody in that lobby could have imagined. And by the end of it, the woman who tore off that badge will understand exactly what she did that morning. If this is the kind of story you want to hear all the way through, give it a like so more people find it. Share it with someone who's ever been made to feel invisible at work, and subscribe, because we tell one of these every single week. Now let's go back to that morning before sunrise, before the badge, before the soup, before anybody in that building knew what was coming. At 4 o'clock in the morning in Fulton Market, at that hour when the city was not yet awake but not entirely asleep, a refrigerated warehouse hidden behind a row of rust-stained shipping containers still had its lights on. Inside, Dale Hollis sat in the only metal chair, both hands resting on his knees, unable to keep them still. He had been waiting there for more than an hour. No one had tied him up. No one was guarding the door. The rolling door behind him remained slightly open, wide enough for a grown man to slip through if he truly wanted to run. Dale Hollis didn't run, because he knew who was coming, and he knew that people who ran from that name usually lasted no more than a week. When Nico Vasari walked in, he came alone. He took off his gloves, placed them on the edge of the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from Hollis. And through all of it, he didn't say a single word. Hollis spoke first, his voice breaking on the very first word, saying that he could explain that there were certain expenses he hadn't had time to document. That business had been a mess these past few years, because they had changed suppliers. Nico waited until he had finished. Then he slid a thin file across the table, no thicker than a magazine, and sat quietly as Hollis turned the pages one by one. There were bank statements. There were reconciliation sheets. There were transfer entries marked in pencil, so faint that only someone who knew exactly what he was looking for would have noticed them. And near the end of the file, there was something that made Hollis stop breathing. Medical school tuition receipts, semester after semester, paid during the exact weeks when that money had left the company. Hollis didn't turn another page. He placed his hand over the file as though he could hide it, though it was already far too late. Nico spoke, his voice quieter than the hum of the refrigeration system overhead, and said that Hollis's daughter didn't know about any of this. He had people look into it. She believed the money came from an education loan her father had taken out in his own name, and she still sent him a thank you message every time tuition was due. Hollis began to tremble harder. He said his little girl was about to take her final examinations. Nico nodded, and said that was precisely why he had come there at 4 o'clock in the morning, instead of letting the matter follow its normal course. Then he laid out two choices, as clearly as a man reading the terms of a contract. The first choice was that Hollis kept his job, signed a repayment schedule stretched out long enough that it wouldn't destroy him, accepted supervision over every expense until the debt was paid in full, and watched his daughter graduate without ever having to read her father's name in a place where she would never want to see it. The second choice was that the file would be sitting on a prosecutor's desk before lunch, and everything that happened after that would no longer be in the hands of anyone sitting in that room. Hollis asked, in a voice that was barely there at all, why Nico was giving him a choice. Nico looked at him for a long time before answering that he didn't give anyone choices out of kindness. He gave choices because dragging an innocent daughter into this was something he didn't do, and no one should ever mistake his patience for decency, because the only thing those two had in common was that they were both silent. Hollis lowered his head, his shoulders shaking, and he wept like a man who had held himself together for too long in the face of something he had always known was wrong. Nico didn't comfort him. He didn't look away to preserve the other man's dignity either. He simply sat there and let the man finish crying, because he believed that forcing someone to hold back tears in front of him was also a form of humiliation. When the sobs finally grew farther apart, Nico stood, picked up his gloves, put on his coat, and delivered his final words in the same even voice he had carried when he first walked in, saying that Hollis should go home, sleep for a few hours, then sit down with a pen and do the math, because he didn't need Hollis to fear him. He needed Hollis to know exactly how much he owed and exactly how much time he had left. Then he walked out of the warehouse, crossed the dew-soaked yard, and climbed into the driverless car waiting for him. Dawn still hadn't come. He had 2 hours left before the night shift at the tower on West Wacker ended, and he didn't want to be late. About half an hour's drive southwest, in a second-floor apartment in Bridgeport. The kitchen lights had been on for a long time. Peg Sullivan always woke before her daughter, and she did it not because she needed less sleep, but because she needed to give herself a reason to leave the bed. Every morning, she made potato soup with onions and a little chopped bacon, the dish her husband used to call food for poor people with self-respect, and she cooked it from memory rather than from a recipe, because the recipe had faded from her mind, but the memory hadn't. Her hands no longer obeyed her the way they once had. Since she started dialysis, her fingers had trembled to a rhythm of their own, not painful, only unwilling to stop. And that rhythm had turned things she had done easily for 40 years into small ordeals. That morning, she dropped the lid of the steel thermos twice. The first time, it rolled beneath the stove, and she had to brace one hand against the floor to reach it. The second time, it fell directly onto the counter, making a hard, dry sound in the silent kitchen, and she stood looking at it for a moment before picking it up. The thermos had been dented on one side for many years, a dent left when it fell from the bed of a truck onto the pavement, and Peg had never agreed to replace it, though Maeve had asked several times. Maeve came out while her mother was tightening the lid. She had been awake for quite a while, lying still in the darkness, calculating the same figures she had gone over all week, always arriving at the same answer. She had less than $3,000 left in her account. The rent was due in less than 2 weeks. The payment for her evening course was due even sooner. And if the permanent placement review came and went without anything changing, the insurance coverage paying for her mother's dialysis would expire before winter had even had time to pass. She didn't tell her mother any of it. She poured herself coffee, asked whether Peg had slept well the night before, and Peg said she had. Though they both knew it wasn't true, Peg handed the thermos of soup to her daughter and held onto her hand for one heartbeat longer. She said she had noticed that lately Maeve came home in silence and ate dinner in silence, and that she hadn't asked because she believed her daughter was old enough to choose when she wanted to speak. But there was one thing she wanted to say, because she had seen it happen to people she once worked beside back when she still sold goods at the market, that large workplaces had a way of teaching people, little by little, to behave as though certain human beings simply weren't there. Then she said the words Maeve would carry with her through that entire winter, that whatever she did, she could lower her head if she needed to, but she mustn't let them teach her how to look straight through another person. Maeve nodded and said she knew, that her mother had said it many times before, and Peg smiled and told her she repeated it because she hadn't yet seen her daughter pay the price for those words. Before leaving, Maeve went back into her room to get her coat. She sat on the edge of the bed to retie her shoes, and when she bent down, her eyes drifted toward the darkness beneath the bed, where a cardboard shoebox sat with all 4 corners gone soft, wrapped with 2 stretched rubber bands. Inside were the papers her father had left behind. She knew exactly what was in that box, and she even knew the order of the pages, because the last time she had opened it was on an evening many years earlier, when she still believed that if she read everything carefully one more time, she would find something. She had found nothing. After that, she closed the box, pushed it farther beneath the bed, and never pulled it out again. Maeve stood, picked up the steel thermos, kissed her mother on the forehead, and stepped out into the darkness before dawn. She left home earlier than she needed to, as she did every day, because she had learned that in buildings like the one where she worked, arriving early was the only thing no one could ever mark against her. Maeve reached the tower while it was still dark. During that brief stretch of time each morning when the night shift had not fully ended and the day shift had already begun to arrive, roughly 20 minutes, when the two worlds inside the same building passed one another in the ground floor corridors before separating again. She scanned her badge, greeted the security guard, and stepped into the lobby, where the smell of floor cleaner still lingered. Outside the glass doors, a man selling sandwiches and coffee from a pushcart had pulled his awning close beneath the overhang to shelter from the light sleet. He had been standing there for less than 10 minutes when a day shift security guard came outside, and Maeve heard every word through the glass that this area was not intended for vending, and that he needed to move beyond the building's property line. The vendor said it was raining. The guard said he knew. Then the man pushed his cart out onto the sidewalk and raised the awning again beneath the open sky, and Maeve turned away before she could think any further about it, because she had learned that thinking too much in this place usually cost more than it gave. Ophelia Mendez was waiting for her at the corner of the desk, holding a sheet of paper folded into quarters. She had worked the night cleaning shift in that building for 9 years and usually left at 6 o'clock, but that morning she had stayed behind. They had told her to sign the paper, which stated that she was responsible for the broken floor scrubber in the basement, and that the repair costs would be deducted gradually from her wages. Ophelia said in a low voice that the machine had sounded like a truck climbing a hill since summer, that everyone on the night shift knew it, and that she had reported it 3 times. Maeve took the paper, read it from beginning to end, then handed it back and told her not to sign. She said that if they wanted to deduct money, they needed to produce an equipment inspection report, not a paper asking Ophelia to accept the blame herself, and once her signature was on it, no one would ever ask another question. Ophelia glanced toward the elevators, folded the paper, slipped it into her uniform pocket, and said she would think about it, though they both understood what those words meant for someone in her position. Just then, the elevator opened, and Camille Rourke stepped out, and the rhythm of the lobby seemed to change in a way no one could have named. Ophelia disappeared before Camille could reach the desk. Camille stopped at the counter, looked at the paper coffee cup sitting behind the monitor, and told Maeve to remove it, saying this was where clients entered, not an employee break room. Maeve removed it. Camille heard her greet a visitor and corrected the way she spoke, saying that the greeting sounded too familiar and that people in reception positions should remember what they represented. Maeve said yes. Then, before turning away, Camille paused for another moment and said that Maeve's contract review was approaching, and her advice was that she learn how to be useful without becoming noticeable. After Camille entered the elevator, Maeve's morning shift coworker leaned over and asked whether she was all right, and Maeve shrugged and said she didn't understand it either, because in nearly a year of working there, she had twice been offered transfers to other branches, both times at Camille's suggestion, and both times it had seemed strange because there had never been any issue with her performance reviews. Her coworker said perhaps Camille simply didn't like anyone, and then the conversation drifted away like every other conversation in the lobby. In the basement of that same building, the previous night had been the 9th night for a man listed as Nick Varga on the timesheets. He pushed a trash cart through the service corridors, cleaned the glass inside the freight elevators, and every night he did one additional thing no one noticed. He counted. He counted how many people were actually present during the shift, how many carts were taken from storage, and how many temporary badges were issued at the handover desk. Then he compared those numbers with the figures on the invoices the cleaning contractor sent the company each month, and the distance between the two was far too large to be a mistake. Ezra Lindholm called him shortly before 4 o'clock in the morning, speaking with the voice of a lawyer who hadn't slept well in many nights, and asked how much longer he intended to keep doing this, and whether he understood that if anyone discovered he was down there, they would call it by names that would be very difficult to shake. Nico replied that he was cleaning floors, and that didn't require a lawyer. Ezra asked why he hadn't assigned the work to one of his own people. Nico was silent for a moment, then said that if Uncle Fausto learned what was happening inside that building, he would have the matter settled within 2 hours, in exactly the way men of his generation had always settled things, and after those 2 hours there wouldn't be a single piece of evidence left that anyone could use. That was why he had told no one. He drove alone, parked several blocks away, and left the building before 6 o'clock every morning, just as the day shift workers began walking inside. The following night was the 10th, and it should have ended like the 9 nights before it. Near 6 o'clock in the morning, when the night shift had begun putting things away, Nico was in the lowest storage area, returning the cart, when he heard a sound that belonged to nothing else in that building. a deep vibration running along the concrete ceiling before vanishing, followed immediately by the sound of water. The main pipe running the length of the storage corridor had burst at the joint near the door, and the water didn't come out like a leak, but like something that had been held under pressure for too long and had finally been released. Within a few breaths, the floor was flooded to the ankles. Ofelia Mendez stood at the far end of the corridor, directly beneath a row of steel shelving stacked with boxes of chemicals and toilet paper, and she turned too slowly. Nico saw the legs of the shelving slide across the wet floor before she did, and he had time for only one thing. He crossed the water, seized her arm, and pulled her hard toward him. The shelving tipped in the opposite direction, its steel edge sweeping across the place where his hand had been only a moment before, and he felt a burning line open along his left palm. At the same time, the force of the pull made him lose his footing on the slick floor, and his temple struck the concrete column behind him. For several seconds, every sound in the corridor disappeared. Then it all came back at once. The water, the alarm, Ofelia calling him by the false name she knew. He told her to get out, in a voice that still sounded calm, and she went, because the water behind her was still rising and because, in moments like that, people always listened to whoever could still speak in complete sentences. Nico got to his feet more slowly than he wanted. He reached for the phone in the pocket of the coat, hanging from a hook beside the storage room door, and that hook was now beneath the water, along with the coat, his wallet, and the night shift badge bearing the name Nick Varga. He bent down and searched once, then stopped, because what he needed at that moment wasn't any of those things. He needed to get out. He waded to the service elevator and pressed the button. Nothing happened. The display had gone completely dark, and the indicator light on the doorframe had turned steadily red. The signal anyone who had ever read the building procedures understood, that the flood protection system had automatically isolated the entire basement and locked every elevator that stopped on that level so the water couldn't travel upward through the shafts. It was the correct procedure. It had been written by reasonable people, and it had just turned the basement into a sealed box. He stood there for a moment, his left hand pressed against the front of his coat, and recalculated. The truck ramp door was at the far end and blocked by the fallen shelving. The passage into the neighboring building could only be opened with a badge, and his badge was underwater. He could wait. The rescue crew would arrive, perhaps in 10 minutes, perhaps later, and while he waited, the pounding in his temple was growing heavier, and his vision had begun to hold on to images a little longer than it should, the kind of delay he had seen in other people before, and knew shouldn't be dismissed. So there was exactly one route left. The emergency stairwell at the end of the north corridor was the only exit that didn't depend on electricity, didn't depend on a badge, and couldn't be locked because the law didn't allow it. He knew where it led. He knew very well, because he had studied the plans for that building more times than anyone else inside it that morning. The stairwell ran straight up from the basement and ended at a single door on the ground floor, opening directly into the middle of the main lobby, the marble lobby, where people had already begun to gather at that hour. He didn't want to go through there. Had there been any other choice, he would have taken it. Because for all 10 nights he had worked to make sure no one in that building knew who he was. But the building had locked every other door and left exactly one open. He gripped the handrail and started climbing. Each step took longer than he had calculated. About halfway up, he had to stop, lean his shoulder against the wall, and wait for the wall to stop tilting. Then he kept going. When he reached the final landing, he heard people on the other side of the wall, shoes moving across stone, someone laughing at something that had happened that morning. He looked down at his left hand pressed against the front of his coat, then looked at the door. He raised his right hand to the push bar and shoved. He stumbled out into the spotless marble lobby, soaked through, bleeding from his palm, and barely able to stand. When he rasped out a single name, no one believed him. They saw only a night janitor who had wandered where he didn't belong. Camille Rourke, standing beneath her charity banner in a cobalt blue suit, gave the immediate order to throw him out onto the street. Maeve was the only one who moved. She knelt on the floor, poured liquid from her mother's thermos, and dialed an ambulance on her own phone. It took less than 4 minutes to ruin her. In front of everyone, her badge was violently torn from her neck, sending the steel thermos clattering across the marble as broth spilled everywhere. And then, as she was gathering her things up off the floor, the bleeding man lifted his head and asked her one question. "What is your full name?" The glass door closed behind her with the soft sigh of its hydraulic hinge. a sound she had heard thousands of times without ever noticing, and now she knew she would never forget it. Maeve stopped on the sidewalk beneath the half-rain, half-ice of a Chicago November, clutching her bag and the dented steel thermos that now felt almost weightless. Her fingers were still slick with broth and had already begun to stiffen in the cold, while the smell of onions and bacon lingered on the cuff of her sleeve. She didn't cry. She stood there long enough for several people passing by to glance at her before continuing on, and during that time, her mind didn't go to the badge, or to the faces that had stood watching, or to the remark about poverty spreading through the air conditioning. It went straight to something else, something far more concrete, and therefore far more cruel. Her mother's dialysis appointment was on Thursday. The insurance that paid for those treatments was tied to her employment contract, and that contract had ended less than 4 minutes ago. She calculated it again in her head, as though doing the arithmetic one more time might somehow produce a different answer. The number of days left before the insurance expired, the amount of money remaining in her account, the cost of a single session if she had to pay for it herself, a figure she had asked about once at the admissions desk and had never asked about again. What she had just lost wasn't a job. The job was only the shell around it. What had been taken from her hands, right there on that marble floor, was the 3 treatments each week that kept her mother able to sit in the kitchen before dawn. She pulled the zipper of her coat all the way to her chin and walked toward the train station, and throughout the entire journey, she did only one thing. She opened her phone and wrote down every moment of that morning in the exact order she remembered it, because memory was the only thing she had left that no one had taken from her yet. High above her, in the tower she had just left, Camille Rourke closed the door to her office and locked it. She didn't sit down immediately. She stood beside her desk, opened the internal records system, and typed into the search box the name the man in the lobby had mentioned. There was no photograph. There was no biography, no interview, nothing except a line identifying the legal entity that held the controlling interest and a registered address somewhere else. Camille closed the screen and stood motionless for nearly a minute. Then she remembered something she passed every day and had never once stopped to read. The small brass plaque mounted on the wall to the left of the lobby, beside the entrance to the guest elevators, bearing the name of a scholarship fund for the children of cleaning workers. The name on that plaque was Rosaria Vasari. Camille sat down. She didn't panic. In 20 years of working, she had learned that panic was a luxury, reserved for people who had nothing to lose, while those with much to lose had to sit down and put things in order. She opened the second screen, where the expenditures for the program she represented were displayed, and looked at them the way someone looked at a house they had lived in for years, and suddenly realized the foundation was cracking. She told herself, not for the first time, that she had never taken everything. Some of the meals had truly been handed out. Some people had truly been given jobs. The photographs were real. The people were real. And there had been mornings when she stood outside in the cold until her feet went numb, giving things to people who had no one else to give them anything. Only 3 of the contractors existed mainly on paper, and the names attached to them belonged to her brother-in-law, an old classmate, and a man who had once worked for her husband. She repeated to herself the argument she had used for nearly 2 years, that the program had been nothing before she took charge of it, that she had personally knocked on the door of every partner, personally stood in front of the cameras, personally turned an old name lying silent on a brass plaque into something the press was willing to write about. If she was the one who had created the value, then keeping part of that value for herself was merely a form of payment no one had been willing to put into a contract. She had believed that argument for so long that it no longer needed her belief. Then she picked up the phone, called the payroll office, and began putting things in order. In another building, several blocks away, Adele Whitmore was sitting at her computer when the desk phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to a nurse, who said a patient had been brought in from the building on West Wacker, that he had no identification, and that he insisted they call this number using the 3 words, the Rosaria file. Adele sprang to her feet so quickly that her chair rolled into the wall. She had worked for that family long enough to know that only 5 people in the world were permitted to say those words. When she heard his voice over the phone, hoarse and slower than usual, she didn't ask whether he was all right. She asked what he needed. Nico gave her 3 instructions. The first was to find the night shift supervisor and preserve that night's timesheets exactly as they were. The second was to call Ezra. The third, which he delivered more slowly than the first 2, was to preserve every piece of data from that building from that moment forward. the security footage, the access logs, every entry in the payroll system, especially anything connected to the employee code of the woman who had knelt beside him. Adele asked for the name. Nico spelled it one letter at a time. Less than an hour later, Ezra Lindholm's data preservation order had reached the contractor operating the camera system, and no one inside the tower knew. That night, close to 11 o'clock, a reimbursement claim appeared in the company's payroll system under Maeve Sullivan's employee code, in the amount of $9,400, described as an advance for emergency assistance expenses received in cash 2 weeks earlier. 4 minutes later, Camille Rourke's account approved it. The electronic signature attached to it was Maeve's real signature, cut from a taxi reimbursement form she had signed back in March, on the night the train broke down near Clark, a claim for less than $40 that she had signed while her hand was still numb with cold. Rhonda Pace saw the entry close to midnight as she was closing the books. She sat motionless in front of the screen for a long time, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood far too clearly. That morning, she had opened that exact ledger 3 times. The entry hadn't existed. She knew the precise times she had opened it. She knew exactly which filters she had used, and an amount of nearly $10,000 couldn't have escaped her notice all 3 times. She moved the cursor toward the print icon, then pulled her hand back. Then, she raised her phone and took a single photograph of the screen, shut down the computer, and sat in the darkness of the office for a while longer. At around the same time, in the second-floor apartment in Bridgeport, Maeve's phone lit up. She had been lying still for a long time, her eyes open, listening to her mother turn over in the next room. The message was from Human Resources, with the subject line stating Notice of Contract Termination for Serious Misconduct. The first allegation was that she had allowed an unauthorized person into a restricted area. The second was that she had failed to follow a manager's instructions in front of clients. She read those 2 and felt nothing except exhaustion. Then she read the third allegation, and she sat upright in bed. The letter stated that she had misappropriated $9,400 from the Emergency Assistance Fund, that her remaining wages would be withheld until the money had been recovered, and that this information might be provided to any organization requesting verification about her in the future. Maeve read it a second time, then a third. She stared at her name beside an amount of money she had never touched. Then she set the phone down, knelt on the floor, and reached into the darkness beneath the bed. The shoebox came out beneath a layer of dust. The 2 rubber bands had grown brittle and snapped the moment she pulled them. Inside, everything remained in the exact order she remembered. The death certificate, a photograph taken at the construction site, the insurance company's letter, and at the very bottom, the report the contractor had produced after her father fell from the scaffolding, the document stating that he had received safety training and signed an acknowledgement, the document that had turned him into a careless worker in every record that remained of his life. Maeve placed it on the floor beneath the bedside lamp. Then she opened her phone, opened the attachment from the Human Resources email, enlarged the signature, and placed the screen beside the paper. She sat between those 2 things for a very long time. Outside, freezing rain tapped against the window frame, and in the next room, her mother's breathing remained as steady as a clock. Maeve had no way to slow down. Her phone vibrated again a little after 1 o'clock in the morning, and this time it was an unfamiliar number, with no name and no profile picture. The message contained only 3 sentences. Don't sign anything they give you. Demand that the company preserve all lobby camera footage from this morning, and make the demand in writing tonight. Don't wait until morning. Whoever had sent it didn't give a name, and when Maeve called back, the phone had already been turned off. She sat staring at the screen for a while, and then she did what she would later come to believe was the most important decision she made during that entire winter. She trusted the stranger. She switched on the desk lamp, opened her computer, and began to type. She didn't write a single word about how deeply she had been hurt. She wrote the way people wrote an official record. She denied receiving any money from the Emergency Assistance Fund and stated clearly that she had never had access to that fund. She requested a copy of the reimbursement claim being cited, the approval log attached to it, and the specific provision in company policy that she was accused of violating. She demanded an opportunity to present her account before any conclusion was treated as final. And in the final paragraph, she wrote in the simplest words she knew that she was requesting the company preserve, in their original and complete form, all footage from the main lobby and all access logs from that day, along with every payroll record connected to her employee code, and that she would consider the disappearance of any of those records a matter of serious concern. She read it 3 times, corrected 2 places, and sent it. She sent it to Human Resources, Payroll, the staffing agency that had signed her contract, and Camille Rourke herself. Then she took a screenshot of every message, including the displayed time each one had been sent, and forwarded them all to a private email account she had created long ago and barely ever used. Outside the window, dawn still hadn't come. When she stood up, she saw that the kitchen light was still on. Peg was sitting at the table with a glass of warm water, wrapped in her old cardigan, and she didn't ask a single question. She looked at her daughter for a while, then said in a voice made hoarse by the late hour that she didn't need to know what had happened. She only wanted to say one thing, that whatever Maeve decided to do, she mustn't let it end with her having to apologize to herself. Maeve nodded. She poured another half glass of water for her mother, switched off the kitchen light, and they both went to bed without saying anything more. At 9 o'clock the following morning, Maeve arrived at the staffing agency's office in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, a narrow row of small rooms with peeling paint on the walls and 3 plastic chairs lined up along the entrance. The man responsible for her file placed a packet of 6 pages on the desk and pushed it toward her, along with a pen whose cap had already been removed. He said that if she signed that day, the company could release half of her outstanding wages within 1 business week, and that this would allow the matter to end quietly for everyone. Maeve read. The first page stated that she was voluntarily ending her contract. The second stated that she accepted responsibility for the missing funds. The third stated that she agreed not to speak about the client company in any form. The fourth authorized deductions from any payments she might receive in the future. She read all 6 pages slowly, and while she did, the man tapped his fingers against the desk twice, then stopped. She pushed the packet back toward him. He told her she needed to be realistic, that this client was very large, and the matter had already been decided. Maeve asked that if everything had already been decided, why did they still need her signature? He said it was procedure. She said procedure meant asking what had happened before, deciding who was guilty, and this wasn't procedure. This was a piece of paper designed to make sure no one would ever have to ask another question. He lowered his voice and told her she wasn't strong enough to fight people like them, and that if she walked out without signing, her money could be withheld indefinitely. Maeve stood, pulled the strap of her bag over her shoulder, and said she wasn't fighting anyone. She was only refusing to confess to something she hadn't done, and he was welcome to write in her file that she was hungry, because that was true, but her hunger wasn't evidence against her. Then she walked out, went down the stairs, and had to stop at the bottom for a moment, until her knees stopped trembling. That afternoon, Fausto Vasari entered the hospital room on the 7th floor without knocking, because in all 64 years of his life, he had never knocked on the door of anyone in the family. He placed his hat on the table, pulled a chair close to the bed, and sat there looking at his nephew for a long time before saying anything. Nico was propped against the pillows, his left hand bandaged to the wrist, while a faint bruise at his temple had deepened into the color of fruit left too long. Fausto looked at that hand the way a man looked at a crack in the wall of his own home. Then he spoke in the low, deliberate voice of someone accustomed to saying little and being heard closely, telling Nico that his older brother, Nico's father, had built the Vasari name from nothing, and that he had done it not because of lawyers, but because of one simple truth. Everyone knew that laying a hand on a member of the Vasari family was a very expensive mistake. Nico didn't answer. Fausto continued, saying that he had heard everything that had happened in that lobby, every single detail, and that in his time, something like this would have been settled within 2 hours. Not 2 weeks, not 2 months, but 2 hours. People didn't need reports to understand they had made a mistake. They only needed to know who had just walked into the room. Nico asked how his uncle intended to settle it. Fausto opened his hands, the gesture of a man who believed the answer was so obvious that speaking it aloud was unnecessary, and said there were ways that didn't require touching anyone at all. A few people only had to appear in the right place, at the right time, and remain silent. After that, everything arranged itself. He said he couldn't understand why his nephew was sitting in a hospital bed with stitches in his hand while talking about files. Nico listened until he had finished, then said no. He spoke only that one word, and he said it more quietly than Fausto had spoken, which made it carry more weight in that room. Fausto leaned back in his chair. He asked when this family had learned to be afraid. Nico said he wasn't afraid. He was counting. He said that if they did things his uncle's way, the woman would be gone from her position, within 2 hours. 3 days later, the company would have a new director of client relations, and 6 months after that, there would still be some cleaner having money taken from her wages for a machine that had already been broken, still someone signing a document they hadn't been allowed to read carefully, and no one would remember what had happened. He said he didn't want a head. He wanted the pipeline that had been feeding that head for nearly 2 years. At that moment, Ezra Lindholm entered, carrying a document case, and greeted Fausto with the nod of a man who knew he had stepped into the middle of a conversation that wasn't meant for him. Ezra placed a thin file on the small table beside the bed and opened it to the first page. He spoke to Fausto, not Nico, saying that the company was operating under an agreement with the federal authorities, and that a woman named Marguerite Sloan had been appointed to oversee everything they did, and she had been in that position long enough to recognize when a coincidence was no longer a coincidence. Ezra said that if anyone appeared in the right place, at the right time, and remained silent, as had just been suggested, the record wouldn't call it silence. It would call it something else, and that name alone would be enough to have every piece of evidence they were collecting thrown out, enough to place everything Nico's father had built over 40 years under someone else's control within a single season. Fausto looked at the file but didn't pick it up. He said that in his time, men didn't allow a piece of paper to decide what they could do inside their own house. Ezra closed his case and answered in the calm voice of a man who had repeated the sentence many times in his mind before speaking it aloud, saying that this was precisely the difference between the two matters. He said he understood the desire to answer an insult, and he wasn't going to persuade anyone that such a desire was wrong. But what was happening inside that building wasn't about one person being insulted. Money had been flowing away for nearly 2 years, through a carefully designed pipeline. Names had been removed from payroll before anyone had time to ask why, and one woman had been branded a thief in the space of a single morning. Then Ezra looked directly at Fausto and said that he wasn't investigating an insult. He was investigating a machine, and a machine didn't die from fear. It died only through paperwork. 3 days later, the board of directors was summoned on a Wednesday afternoon, with notice sent less than a day beforehand, and none of them knew exactly why. The conference room occupied the highest floor, its glass walls looking out over the leaden gray lake, and when everyone had taken their seats, the chair at the head of the table remained empty. Nico entered last. He didn't walk toward that chair. He closed the door, moved along the wall, and stopped at the far end of the room, standing there with his left hand still bandaged, and he said nothing. During the first 10 seconds, several people continued scrolling through their phones out of habit. At the 12th second, the person sitting nearest the door placed his phone face down on the table. A moment later, the second person followed, then the third, and the soft clicking of screens being turned over traveled down the conference table like a signal no one had given. Warren Petrakis, seated near the head of the table, removed his glasses and set them down. Only when the room had grown so quiet that they could hear the wind striking the glass outside did Nico speak, and all he said was that now they were listening. His presentation was brief. He spoke about the difference between the number of people who actually worked inside the building each night and the number listed on the cleaning contractor's invoices. He spoke about 3 contractors participating in the company's charitable program, whose registration documents all led back to the same address. He spoke about deductions taken from the wages of contract workers when no one could produce the acknowledgement records anymore. Then he asked the board to approve an expansion of the review to include every contract terminated during nearly the past 2 years, every deduction, and the entire chain of vendors connected to the program. Most of them raised their hands almost immediately, because in a room that had just been silent for 40 seconds, it was difficult to do anything else. Only Petrakis spoke before the vote. He said that he supported clarifying every figure, of course, but he had served on that board longer than most of the people present, and he had seen what happened when a company opened all of its records, while government officials were watching. He said a review that broad would create thousands of pages of documents, and anyone could pull out one passage and turn it into an unpleasant story, and reputation was something that disappeared faster than money. For that reason, he would vote against the proposal, not because he opposed finding the truth, but because he believed the work should be done one part at a time. No one argued with him. It was the sort of opinion people heard from older board members in every company, and it passed into the minutes like a line of ordinary notation. The proposal was approved with one opposing vote. That same afternoon, 2 floors below, Rhonda Pace was called into Camille Rourke's office. A fully typed statement was already waiting on the desk, with only the signature line left blank. Rhonda read it. It stated that on a previous afternoon, Maeve Sullivan had asked her how to withdraw money from the Emergency Assistance Fund without obtaining second-level approval. Rhonda said that had never happened. Camille didn't argue. She only said that she was the person who approved payroll exceptions, so she knew quite a lot about the circumstances of those working beneath her. She mentioned the loan Rhonda still owed to the Employee Assistance Fund. She mentioned the college tuition being deducted from Rhonda's pay each month. Then she said that the payroll team leader position would become available at the beginning of the following year, that she was the person who made the nomination, and that all Rhonda had to do that day was place one signature at the bottom of a page. Rhonda looked at the pen lying across the paper. Fear spoke first, as it always did, telling her that the other woman had already been fired, that the truth couldn't repay a loan, that the people above always survived while witnesses didn't. Then she remembered what she had seen through the opening elevator doors that morning. A woman kneeling on the marble floor beside a man no one else wanted to look at. She said she needed more time to read the statement carefully. Camille remained silent for several seconds, then told her to leave. And before Rhonda closed the door, she added that some people fell not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had stood too close to someone else's trouble. At noon the following day, when Rhonda logged into the system, the screen informed her that her access had been restricted while a payroll discrepancy was under review. No one offered any further explanation. That afternoon, she went down to the underground parking garage, sat in her car with the engine turned off, opened her phone, and sent the photographs she had taken, accompanied by a single line saying that this was created after you left the building. The review began with the dullest things anyone could imagine, and the first person invited in wasn't an executive at all, but the night shift supervisor for the cleaning contractor. Manny Ruiz arrived on time, 10 minutes early, wearing the finest coat he owned and carrying a plastic-covered notebook that he never once opened throughout that afternoon. If anyone in that building had asked the night shift workers whom they trusted most, nearly all of them would have given the same name. Manny was the one who found extra shifts for people who urgently needed money. Manny was the one who drove workers with aching backs all the way home at 4 o'clock in the morning. Manny was the one who remembered the names of every worker's wife and children, and remembered their birthdays too. Ezra Lindholm had read his file before entering the room, and in the margin he had written a single reminder to himself that he should be careful with people everyone loved, because they were the ones best positioned to escape anyone's scrutiny. Ezra began with the easy questions. What time did the night shift begin? Who assigned the work areas? Which storage room did they take the carts from? Manny answered completely and clearly, without a single unnecessary word. Then Ezra placed 3 sheets of paper on the table, each one a monthly labor certification submitted with the contractor's invoice, and asked whether he recognized the signature at the bottom of the page. Manny looked down, and he didn't pretend to need time. He said yes, it was his signature. Ezra asked whether he knew the number listed there didn't match the number of people who had actually been present during the shift. Manny remained silent for several moments. Then he said he knew. In the room, the person taking the minutes stopped typing for 1 second, then began again. Ezra asked how long it had been going on. Manny said, nearly 2 years. Ezra asked whether he had signed every one of those forms during that period. Manny said yes, every one. Ezra allowed the silence to stretch, the kind of silence every lawyer knew how to use, an empty space people often filled with things they had never intended to say. Manny didn't fill it. He sat still, both hands resting on the plastic-covered notebook, and stared directly at the tabletop. Ezra asked whether he had received any money. Manny said no. Ezra asked whether anyone had promised him anything. Manny said no. Ezra asked whether anyone had pressured him, and he asked this question more slowly than the others, because he had practiced law long enough to know that this was the door. Manny looked at him for a long time. Then he said that he had signed them, and he had nothing more to say about it. Ezra told him that if there were circumstances that had forced him to do it, now was the time to explain, because once the file was sent forward, there would be no one left sitting there willing to listen. Manny nodded as though he understood that very well. Then he spoke the second and final sentence he would offer that afternoon, saying that he had signed them, and Ezra should write that down. Ezra tried once more. He asked whether Manny understood what this would mean for the people being investigated because of those numbers, and whether he knew that a woman had just been branded a thief in her record simply because she had stood too close to the pipeline his signature had helped keep flowing. Manny listened to every word. Something passed across his face for an instant, so quickly that the person taking the minutes didn't see it, though Ezra did. Then, it disappeared. Manny stood, picked up the plastic-covered notebook, and said that if Ezra needed him to sign any additional document confirming what he had just said, he could hand it over and Manny would sign it right then. Ezra told him to sit down. Manny said he would like to leave, that the night shift began at 10 o'clock, and he still had to assign the work areas. Then he walked out and closed the door very softly, the way people closed the door to a room where someone was sleeping. When the sound of his footsteps had completely faded in the corridor, the person taking the minutes looked up and asked Ezra whether the final part should be included. Ezra looked at the 3 sheets still lying on the table, 3 identical signatures, and said to write down everything, every single word. Then he remained there alone for a long time, because throughout his career he had met many people who confessed, but he had never met anyone who confessed and then refused to defend himself. The invitation arrived in Maeve's inbox on a Friday morning, sent from a law office in the Loop district of the city, and signed by Ezra Lindholm, stating that he represented an independent review panel and wanted to hear her account of how her contract had been terminated. She read it 4 times and nearly deleted it. In her evening class, the instructor had warned them about meetings like this, where a dismissed employee was invited in to talk and then had their own words used against them. So she didn't answer yes or no. She answered with 4 questions. Would the meeting be recorded? Would she be allowed to bring a witness? Would she receive a copy of anything she signed? And would her attendance be interpreted as an admission of the allegations? Ezra replied in less than 15 minutes, with a single yes to all 4 questions. She arrived on Monday morning wearing the cleanest outfit left in her closet, and the office was smaller than she had imagined, with no marble, no large logo, only a few bookshelves, and an old coffee maker. Ezra came out to greet her himself. He told her she could record the meeting on her own phone if she wished, and that simple sentence loosened something inside her chest. The questioning lasted nearly 2 hours. Ezra began with what had happened before the man entered the lobby, not with the moment he came in, and Maeve understood that this was the sign of someone who knew what he was looking for. He asked who had the key to the emergency assistance fund. She said she had never even seen that key. He asked whether she had ever been given approval authority. She said no, and added that she didn't even know what password format the system used. Then Ezra placed a printed copy of the reimbursement form on the table, with the signature enlarged. Maeve looked at it for only a few seconds before raising her eyes. She said that it was indeed her signature, but it hadn't been placed on that document. Ezra asked how she knew. She said there was a small space after the first letter of her last name, and she had signed that way only once, back in March, on a taxi reimbursement form for a little over $30. On the night the train broke down near Clark, and she had to take a cab home close to 2 o'clock in the morning, with hands so cold she could barely hold the pen steady. Ezra wrote it down and asked whether she was certain about the amount. Maeve said she remembered clearly every dollar that belonged to her. He almost smiled, and then he didn't. At that moment, the inner door opened. The man who entered wore a white shirt and dark trousers, and Maeve rose so quickly that her chair struck the wall. She didn't recognize him by his face. That face was clean, freshly shaven, and looked nothing like the one she had seen on the marble floor that morning. She recognized him by his left hand, by the line of stitches running across his palm, in the exact place where she had pressed the gauze down and counted silently how much longer it would be before the ambulance arrived. Ezra introduced him. Maeve heard the name, heard the title that followed it, and lowered herself back into the chair very slowly. In that silence, she didn't think about shares. She didn't think about the tower, and she didn't think about how she had been right while Camille Rourke had been wrong. She thought about something else, and it came to her so suddenly that she spoke before she had time to consider it. She said that she had walked past him 3 times. Ezra looked up. Maeve continued, saying that the night shift ended at 6 o'clock, and she arrived at around 20 minutes before 6, and every morning there was a brief stretch in the ground floor corridor when the 2 shifts crossed paths, and during the mornings of the previous week she had passed him 3 times and greeted him 3 times. She said she remembered greeting him, but she couldn't remember his face. She sat in silence for a moment, then said that for nearly a year in that building, she had kept telling herself she was different from the people upstairs, that she still asked others for their names, still remembered who was sick, still knew who needed extra shifts. Yet somehow she had learned the same habit after all. She had simply learned to do it more politely, nodding and smiling while her eyes passed straight through people. Her mother had warned her about exactly this, and she had listened. and she had still become that way. Ezra said nothing. Nico pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and he didn't comfort her. He only said that she remembered her mother's thermos, and she didn't remember him, and that didn't matter. Then he added that on the one morning when he needed a human being to be there, she had been there, and he didn't need her to be perfect. He needed her to be the person who stepped forward. Maeve asked why he had been in the basement, and she asked him directly, because it was the only question that entire morning she felt she had the right to ask. Nico didn't answer at once. He turned the plain steel ring around his finger once, then said that his mother had come to this country when she was 19 years old, unable to speak the language and knowing no one, and the first job she found was cleaning offices at night in the downtown district. She did that work for more than a decade. He said that when he was a boy, he sometimes went with her to work on nights when there was no one to look after him, sitting in the corner of a hallway doing his homework while she cleaned, and he still remembered how she had taught him to wring out a cloth without straining his wrist, because she told him that if he did it wrong, by the time he was 50 he wouldn't be able to lift his hand anymore. Then he spoke about the year 2009. His mother slipped on a freshly cleaned floor on an upper level of a building she had maintained for years. Her leg was injured. The building manager came down, acted kindly, and handed her a document, telling her that if she signed it, she would receive paid leave until she recovered. The paper was written in a language she could understand when spoken but couldn't read well, and it stated that she accepted responsibility for her own fall and declined medical treatment. She signed it. She continued working for more than 10 days because rent never waited for anyone. Then she didn't survive, and Nico was 22 years old that year. Nico said the charitable program bearing her name had been established afterward, and he had allowed it to operate for years without looking closely because he had been occupied with things he believed were more important. That changed when he noticed the numbers didn't match. He said he had gone into the basement not to test anyone, and not as a disguise, but because he wanted to count for himself, and because money was disappearing from a name he would not allow anyone to touch. Maeve remained silent for a long time. Then Nico moved to another subject, speaking the way someone read contractual terms, briefly and clearly. He said the accusation of misappropriation would be suspended immediately pending the final findings. Every dollar of her withheld wages would be paid in full. Her contract would be converted to permanent employment without any further review period. Then he delivered the final part more slowly, saying that the highest level insurance plan the company offered would be activated for her mother, effective within 1 day, and that not a single dialysis treatment would be interrupted. Maeve looked down at her hands resting in her lap. Inside her mind, everything she had arranged and rearranged through so many sleepless nights suddenly had a way out, and that way out stood only one word away. Yes. She thought about Thursday. She thought about the dented steel thermos and her mother's trembling hands. She thought about the rent notice lying on the kitchen table, the one she had kept face down for 3 days, so she wouldn't have to look at it. She sat that way long enough for Ezra to glance up at her. Then she thought of Ophelia Mendez standing at the corner of the desk, with the paper folded into quarters in her hand, and of how she had said she would think about it, and of how both of them had understood exactly what those words meant. Maeve raised her head and said that she was grateful, but she couldn't accept it this way. Nico showed no reaction. She continued, saying that if he brought back only her, then the following month someone else would still be dragged out of that lobby, and that person wouldn't have anyone sitting in this room to speak with him. She said she didn't want to become proof that everything was working properly, because no one had begun examining any of it until they discovered whom she had helped. Then she asked the question that left the entire room silent. She asked whether there would be an investigation now if he truly had been nothing more than a man who cleaned floors that morning. Nico didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his white bandaged hand for a long time, long enough for the generator in the neighboring building to rise into a low hum and then fall silent again. Then he said no, there probably wouldn't be. Maeve nodded and said that was what needed to be repaired, not merely her personal record. Ezra asked what she wanted. Maeve said she wanted a written process for every contract worker. She wanted every wage deduction to have documented grounds and to be clearly explained. She wanted complaints reviewed by someone other than the person being accused in the complaint. And she wanted security guards trained to help an injured person before passing judgment on that person's clothes. Then she said the final thing, more quietly than anything she had said before. She said she didn't need his money. She needed what her father had never been given, a piece of paper stating that he hadn't lied. Nico looked at her for a moment, then turned to Ezra and told him to expand the scope to everything. every terminated contract, every deduction, and every contractor connected to the program. Maeve thanked him and asked him to put everything he had just said in writing. Nico almost laughed. Ezra actually did. 3 days later, while reviewing the personnel files of every management-level employee under the scope approved by the board, Ezra Lindholm stopped at the second page of Camille Rourke's employment history. Before joining this company, she had spent many years as Director of Risk Management and Compensation for a construction contractor on the west side of the city. Ezra read the company's name twice. Then he reopened his notes from the meeting with Maeve, found the passage where she had spoken about her father, and sat in silence for quite a while before picking up the phone. He called her and asked only one question: whether she remembered the name of the company her father had worked for in the year he fell from the scaffolding. Maeve gave him the name immediately, because there are some names people don't need to remember. They simply remain there. The other end of the line went silent for several seconds. Then Ezra told her to find that report again, and told her not to look only at the signature. That evening, Maeve spread the document across the kitchen table beneath the yellow light. She had held it in her hands more times than she could count over the years. But every time, her eyes had gone directly to the signature in the middle of the page, the signature bearing her father's name that she knew wasn't his, and she had remained there until she couldn't bear it any longer, then folded the paper away. She had never read the section at the very bottom. This time, she did. In the lower right corner, beneath the space reserved for internal review, there was a handwritten line in blue ink, the writing neat and slanted, stating that the file had been reviewed, and beside it were initials followed by the same shortened name, C. Rourke. Maeve sat perfectly still. Outside, traffic continued moving along the street, and in the kitchen there was only the steady hum of the refrigerator. She raised a hand to her mouth, lowered it again, then reached for the phone. Peg was watching television in her room, and when her daughter came in and sat on the edge of the bed, she muted it immediately, because one look at Maeve's face told her enough. Maeve asked whether her mother remembered the meeting at the company that day, the meeting where they had invited her in to inform her of their conclusion. Peg said she remembered. Maeve asked who had been there. Peg was silent for a moment, then began to speak slowly, in the way people tell a story they have repeated inside their own minds, thousands of times, without ever saying it aloud. She said there had been 2 men in dress shirts, a younger person taking notes, and a woman sitting at the head of the table. She said she couldn't remember the woman's name, but she remembered that the woman had been beautifully dressed, with her hair neatly tied back, and before saying anything at all, she had pushed a box of tissues toward Peg, making the gesture so naturally that it seemed she had done it many times before. Peg said she even remembered the perfume, a sweet fragrance, and that for many years afterward, whenever she passed someone wearing the same scent, she would feel a slight tightness in her chest without understanding why. Then she continued, her voice still even, saying that the woman had spoken to her very gently, telling her that her husband had received full safety training, had signed the acknowledgement, and that the company was deeply sorry, but this had been an accident caused by the workers' decision to disregard procedure. Peg said she had listened to everything, thanked them, and walked all the way to the bus stop before she cried, because she hadn't wanted to cry inside that building. Maeve sat silently, still holding the folded paper in her lap. She didn't tell her mother what she had just discovered. She asked only one more question: whether her mother remembered if that woman had ever asked for her father's name. Peg thought for a long time, then shook her head and said no. From beginning to end, the woman had called him the worker. On Thursday evening, Maeve took her mother to the dialysis center as usual, and returned home close to 9 o'clock. The lock hadn't been forced. The door was still closed, and for one brief moment, she even thought she might have forgotten to turn off the bedroom light. But when she stepped inside, she saw that the drawer of the nightstand had been pulled open and not pushed all the way back, that the bedsheet had been disturbed, and that the space beneath the bed looked brighter than usual because nothing remained there to block the light. The television was still untouched on its shelf. The laptop was still on the dining table, exactly where she had left it that morning. The glass jar filled with loose change was still there. Only one thing was missing, and she stood in the middle of the room for a long time before allowing herself to name it. She knelt, reached into the darkness beneath the bed, and swept her hand from side to side, touching only dust and an old sock. The shoebox was gone. She lowered herself to the floor, leaned her back against the side of the bed, and for nearly a minute she couldn't think at all. Then she laughed, a short, dry sound with nothing joyful in it. because on the night she had read the writing in the bottom corner of that document, the first thing she had done wasn't call anyone. She had taken every paper from the box and photographed each one, front and back, then uploaded the images to 2 separate places and sent another copy to Ezra. She had done it close to 2 o'clock in the morning, sitting in the very place where she was sitting now. She sent Ezra 3 lines, photographed the condition of the room, and called no one else. But she couldn't sleep in that apartment that night. She locked the door twice, sat on the bed with the light on, and sometime after 11 o'clock she put on her coat, walked to the station, and took the last train to the hospital where her mother had been kept overnight for observation. She told the nurse on duty that she would sit in the hallway, and they allowed her to stay. The plastic chair was hard and cold, and she didn't know when she finally drifted off. Near dawn, Peg woke and saw her daughter asleep in the open doorway, her hair fallen across half her face. She didn't call out to her. She only pulled the thin blanket slowly from her own body, folded it, and reached over to place it across her daughter's shoulders. Then she lay still, staring at the ceiling until morning came. During those same hours, somewhere else in the city, something happened that people would only much later understand where to place. According to the statement Camille Rourke later gave her own attorney, when she went down to the underground parking garage beneath the building that evening, 4 men were already standing in the open space between 2 rows of columns. They didn't approach her. No one touched her, no one blocked her path, and no one placed a hand inside his coat. One of them simply opened a small notebook and read aloud, in the ordinary voice of someone reading the weather, what time she usually left the building, which route she took, which gym she visited on Tuesday and Friday mornings, and the name and street of the clinic where she went for her regular examinations. When he had finished, he closed the notebook. Then all 4 men walked toward the vehicle exit and disappeared. And according to Camille, the entire encounter lasted less than 2 minutes. Camille didn't call the police. She sat inside her car for nearly half an hour with both hands resting on the steering wheel, and she didn't panic, because she had already understood that what had just happened wasn't intended to frighten her, or if it was, fear was only a secondary purpose. What had just been placed in her hands was something valuable. The following morning, her attorney submitted a statement to the office of Marguerite Sloan, the appointed monitor, stating that their client, who was currently the subject of an internal review at the company, had been approached by individuals connected to the owner's family under circumstances that carried the nature of a threat, and that the validity of all evidence gathered during that review needed to be reconsidered, because the possibility that witnesses had been influenced couldn't be excluded. Sloan received the filing at noon. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, she had sent summonses to Ezra Lindholm and Nico Vasari, ordering them to appear the following morning, and the letter contained one brief sentence, stating that she expected both men to arrive prepared to answer the question of who had been present in the parking garage that night. That night, Ezra Lindholm arrived at Nico's house close to 11 o'clock, and he didn't take off his coat. He placed the opposing lawyer's submission on the table and said there were 3 ways through this. The first was to deny everything, say that no one in the family knew anything, and force the other side to prove it. The second was to remain silent, neither confirming nor denying, and delay until the review was over. Ezra didn't say the third one aloud, because he knew Nico had already thought of it. Nico sat in the chair by the window, looking down at the stream of headlights moving along the street below, and asked Ezra a very ordinary question. If someone called right now and asked whether he knew who those 4 men were, would he know? Ezra was silent. Nico said that he would. He had known from the moment he read the description in the submission, because the way those 4 men had worked, reading from a small notebook and then walking away, belonged to only one person in his family. The following morning, in Marguerite Sloan's office, Nico sat before a plain wooden desk and answered every question in complete sentences. He gave his uncle's name. He gave the period of time in which he believed the incident could reasonably have occurred. He said he hadn't been there, hadn't given the order, and hadn't known beforehand, but he didn't ask anyone to believe him. Then he handed over a piece of paper bearing 2 license plate numbers that he had ordered checked the night before. Ezra sat beside him, and when Sloan stepped out to retrieve additional forms, he leaned closer and said very quietly that Nico was handing over his own blood, and that no lawyer in the world would advise a client to do such a thing. Nico looked at him and replied that if he sat there and protected his uncle, then he would be exactly what people had always believed him to be, and he would lose the right to demand honesty from anyone else in the company. The meeting ended after 3 hours. Sloan preserved all the evidence already collected, separated the parking garage incident into an independent case, and nothing in the review was invalidated. The price appeared on the final page in one brief sentence, stating that the monitoring period for the related legal entities would be extended by another 3 years. On the drive back, Ezra said nothing for a long stretch. Then he said that 3 years meant 3 years, with someone reading every contract, every expense, and every meeting record. Nico said he knew. Ezra asked whether he thought it was worth it. Nico said that she had 11 months of employment, a mother receiving dialysis 3 times a week, and a name that had just been branded with theft. He had 3 years of someone reading his correspondence. He said he didn't consider those things equal. Fausto Vasari came the following afternoon. He arrived without an invitation, as he always did, and the moment he stepped through the door, he understood why his nephew was looking him directly in the eyes. Nico didn't raise his voice. He poured his uncle a glass of liquor, placed it on the table, then set an envelope beside it. Fausto didn't open it. He asked what Nico had told the government woman. Nico said he had told her the truth. Fausto nodded slowly, then said he had done it for Nico, that he hadn't touched anyone, that it was only the way people reminded one another where they stood. Nico said he knew his uncle hadn't touched anyone. He said that if Fausto had touched someone, everything would have ended that same night. Then he continued, his voice still even, saying that for weeks a woman had been recording every hour and every event on her phone because it was the only thing she had left, that a man had signed documents for nearly 2 years without ever explaining why, and that a file had grown thicker each day with the dullest things in the world. And in 2 minutes inside that parking garage, his uncle had nearly turned all of it into something worthless. Fausto opened the envelope. Inside were documents establishing a lifetime payment in his name and a one-way ticket to Palermo. He looked at both for a long time, then raised his eyes, and for the first time in Nico's life, his uncle looked exactly his age. Fausto asked whether his nephew intended to cast him out. Nico said no. He said his uncle had taught him how to tie a necktie, had carried him in his arms at his father's funeral, and no one could ever take those things away from him. He only said that from that moment forward, he wouldn't allow his uncle to stand near this name anymore, because his uncle's way and the path Nico had chosen couldn't live beneath the same roof. Fausto picked up the envelope and stood. At the door, he stopped and said that Nico's father would never have understood this. Nico said he knew, and that was precisely the problem. Close to 10 o'clock on Friday night, Ezra Lindholm was skimming the weekly internal bulletin when he stopped at a line near the bottom, an announcement about optimizing storage capacity, approved by the audit committee and scheduled to take effect at 2 o'clock on Saturday morning. Beneath it was the name of the person who had signed it, Warren Petrakis. Ezra read it again, then opened the preservation order he himself had sent out that morning, and immediately saw the gap. His order preserved the original files, but the index that led to them belonged to the operational data group, and without the index, those tens of thousands of files would become nothing more than nameless blocks of data that no one could ever locate again. He looked at the clock. There were less than 4 hours left. He called the contractor operating the system, and the person on night duty said that copying the index to an offline drive required confirmation from an account with active privileges in the client's personnel system, along with a paper shift record signed by the supervisor for verification, because that was what the procedure required. Ezra sat motionless for 3 seconds. The only authorized account he knew for certain was still active, belonged to Rhonda Pace, whose access had been restricted in the internal system, but the outside contractor's system synchronized personnel data only once every 3 days, and the next synchronization wasn't scheduled until Monday morning. He called her close to 11 o'clock that night. Rhonda was sitting in front of the television without watching it, and after listening to everything, she asked only one question: where her name would appear if she signed. Ezra said her name would appear in the official record, openly, and anyone who wanted to find it would be able to. She was silent for about 10 seconds, then said that Camille had told her some people fell because they stood too close to someone else's trouble, and she had been thinking about those words for several nights, and now she had finished thinking. She logged in a little after midnight. As for the night shift notebook, Ezra had no idea whom to call. The electronic timesheet was stored inside the very block of data scheduled for deletion, while the paper copy was kept by the supervisor. He called Manny Ruiz without believing the man would answer. Manny picked up on the second ring. Ezra explained briefly what he needed. Manny didn't ask why, didn't ask what he would receive, and only said he was already on his way to work and would stop by the storage room to collect the notebooks. An hour later, he arrived at the contractor's office on the west side of the city, the shoulders of his coat wet, carrying 3 plastic-covered notebooks bound together with rubber bands. He placed them on the table, opened them to the exact pages that were needed, and signed the verification record without reading it again. Once the process was underway, Ezra poured him a glass of water and asked why he had come. Manny sat down, placed both hands on his thighs, and this time he didn't remain silent. He said that nearly 2 years earlier, someone from the company had summoned him upstairs and shown him a draft proposal to terminate the cleaning contract. They told him costs were too high, that if the figures on the invoices couldn't be maintained, they would switch to a cheaper contractor, and the entire night shift would be replaced with new workers. They said all he had to do was certify the numbers they gave him. Manny said he had known it was wrong from the very first sheet, but every time he considered refusing, he thought about the 30 or more people working under him, about the woman who cleaned the 9th floor whose husband was bedridden, about the young man who had just started and was making payments on an old car, about Ophelia, who had cleaned that lobby for 9 years. He said he hadn't taken a single dollar, and Ezra was free to examine his accounts as many times as he wished. Then he said he had kept telling himself that he was protecting the jobs of more than 30 people, until the day he sat in that other room and heard Ezra ask whether he understood that a woman had just been branded a thief merely because she had stood too close to the pipeline. His signature had helped keep flowing. He said he had gone home and sat in his car for the rest of that night. Then he began to cry without making a sound, his shoulders trembling, and he didn't apologize to anyone, didn't beg for anything, and didn't say a single word about wanting to be understood. Ezra left him alone. When Manny finally looked up, Ezra said that his decision to come that night would be entered into the record, and everything he had signed over nearly 2 years would also be entered into the record, and the 2 things would remain beside one another, with neither one erasing the other. Manny nodded and said that was exactly how it should be. The index finished copying close to 2 o'clock in the morning. The person on night duty opened a random file to test it, and the screen showed an overhead view of the main lobby. They moved forward to the portion after Maeve had already left. In the footage, Camille Rourke walked around behind the reception desk and said something to her assistant in a low voice that was almost impossible to hear. Ezra told them to raise the volume. During the final 40 seconds, the assistant asked one brief question: "What about Mr. Petrakis?" Camille answered in the voice of someone responding to something so obvious it was barely worth saying, that he had known for a long time. The insurance company's letter arrived at the beginning of the week, brief and courteous, informing Maeve Sullivan that the benefits tied to her employment contract had expired, and that all expenses incurred from the date stated in the letter would have to be paid by the beneficiary. Maeve read it at the kitchen table, then checked her account balance again, then sat in silence. She had refused Nico Vasari's money, and she still didn't regret it. But her mother's dialysis treatment was on Thursday, and Thursday didn't care whether she regretted anything or not. That afternoon, she called the staffing agency again. The man responsible for her file said the agreement was still available, that if she signed it, the money would arrive within 1 business week, and he sent the 6-page packet to her again by email that same afternoon. She printed it at the copy shop at the end of the street, brought it home, placed it on the table, and sat before it for nearly an hour with a pen in her hand. The 2nd page still stated that she accepted responsibility for the missing funds. She read that sentence long enough to memorize it. That evening, Ophelia Mendez called her and said only that Maeve should come to the parking lot behind the building at 6 o'clock the next morning because she had something to tell her, then hung up before Maeve could ask anything. At 6 o'clock the following morning, it was still dark, and the surface of the parking lot was covered with a thin layer of ice. Maeve walked around to the back and stopped, because Ophelia wasn't the only person waiting there. The entire night shift stood before her. More than 30 people who had just finished work, the shoulders of their coats still wet, their hands still red from cold water, some still wearing gloves, some standing partly hidden behind others because they felt shy. Ophelia stepped forward and handed her a plastic food container, the kind people carried their lunch in. Maeve opened it. Inside was money, most of it small bills rolled tightly and bound with rubber bands, several notes folded into quarters, and one large bill lying at the bottom. Ophelia said that 4 days earlier, Manny had told her about the paper they were trying to make Maeve sign, and ever since then, she had gone to every person on the shift and asked for help. Some had contributed twice. Some had told her not to mention their names. She said the total was $2,115. Maeve started to say that she couldn't accept it, that she knew better than anyone how little each person there earned by the hour. But Ophelia took hold of her wrist and spoke first, saying that she had cleaned that lobby for 9 years, had walked past that desk every morning for 9 years. And in all those years, Maeve was the first person who had ever asked her name. She told her to take it. No one in the crowd applauded, and no one said anything more. They simply stood there in the white mist of their breath on that November morning. Maeve took the 6-page packet from her bag. She tore it apart right there, first in half and then into quarters, and dropped the pieces into the trash can attached to the parking lot light pole. On Thursday afternoon, she took her mother to the dialysis center and paid at the front desk with the money from the plastic container. The cashier counted it for quite a while because most of it was in small bills. When they reached the waiting room, Peg picked up the empty container, looked inside, and asked her daughter where the money had come from. Maeve was about to lie. Then she sat beside her mother and told her the truth from beginning to end, about the 6-page agreement, about the parking lot at 6 o'clock, about the people who had just finished the night shift waiting for her in the thin layer of ice, about the person who had contributed twice, and the people who had asked that their names not be mentioned. Peg listened to all of it, without interrupting. Then she placed the plastic container in her lap, rested both trembling hands on its lid, and began to cry. Maeve had never seen her mother cry, not even at the funeral home that year, not even on the morning she received her first test results. She sat quietly beside her, one hand resting on her mother's shoulder, and let her cry until the nurse called her name. The program's annual gala was held at a riverside hotel on Friday evening the following week, and for the first time in its history, the entire night cleaning crew had been included on the guest list. They sat at 3 tables near the back, wearing the finest clothes they owned, and not one of them understood why they had been invited. Camille Rourke stepped onto the stage close to 8 o'clock, and for the first 3 minutes, she spoke as beautifully as she always did. She thanked the partners. She spoke of the people society had grown accustomed to walking past. Then she said that dignity wasn't something we reserved for the wealthy, but something that belonged to every person who crossed our path. Several people nodded. A reporter typed the sentence into a computer. At that moment, the large screen behind her went dark, and the host stepped forward to announce that before the awards presentation, the board wished to invite the company's controlling owner to speak. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Nico Vasari walked in, and the entire room rose by instinct before anyone had time to understand why they were standing. The coffee cup in Camille's hand slipped from her fingers and shattered on the stone floor. She didn't pick it up. Nico walked onto the stage, bent down, picked up the largest piece of porcelain for her, placed it on the edge of the table, then turned toward the audience and said that he had prepared a speech about the company's journey, but he wouldn't be reading it. He spoke about a morning in early November, when he had stepped out of the emergency stairwell in his own building, and no one had believed him. He said that no one recognizing him hadn't hurt him, because faces could be forgotten. But something else had happened immediately afterward. Then Ezra Lindholm came onto the stage carrying a file, and everything unfolded without music, without theatrics, with nothing but evidence. The security footage appeared on the screen. The entire ballroom watched a badge being torn from a woman's neck. They watched the steel thermos roll across the marble floor. They watched one person kneel beside another. Then the sound was turned on, and Camille's voice came through the speakers, clear down to every word, telling her assistant to place the missing money under the receptionist's name, reuse an old signature, and have payroll process it that very night. At a table in the center of the room, someone covered her mouth. Camille said the recording had been altered. Ezra displayed the verification analysis, the original file's digital signature. The recording time matched against the access logs, and 3 voice samples taken from management meetings. Then Rhonda Pace stood in the middle of the ballroom. Her knees trembled so badly that she had to grip the back of the chair in front of her, but her voice carried through the room as she said that Camille had handed her a prepared statement and promised her a position in exchange for her signature, that she hadn't signed it, and that she had preserved the evidence. Camille said Rhonda was taking revenge because she had been suspended. Ezra placed that exact statement on the screen, recovered from the printer on that floor. And while the ballroom was still filling with noise, Maeve Sullivan rose from the last row and walked toward the front. She wasn't holding a microphone. She went to the edge of the stage, placed a document on the table, its folds worn deep from years of being kept, and pushed it toward Camille. Then she said, loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear, that she hadn't come there to talk about the $9,400. She had only one question. Did Camille remember his name? Camille lowered her eyes to the document. She looked at it for a very long time, long enough for the host to step forward and then retreat again. Then she raised her head and said no. She said she had signed hundreds of documents like it every year, that she couldn't remember them, and that this was exactly what had made it so easy. No one in the ballroom said a word. Maeve nodded once, then spoke her father's name clearly, one word at a time, his full first and last name. She said that from that night forward, his name would remain in Camille's record, in the exact place where Camille had placed her name in his, and this time, someone would remember. Then she turned and walked back to her seat. Camille stood motionless on the stage. The board chairman began reading the motion to suspend all of her executive and financial authority. And in the middle of it, instead of remaining silent, Camille turned toward the board's table, searched for someone in the front row, and said in a voice that was strangely calm that she wasn't the person who had opened that account. She was only the one who had signed it. Her attorney sprang to his feet and seized her arm. Nearly 400 people in the ballroom didn't understand what those words meant. Nico Vasari, standing at the edge of the stage with the stitches on his left hand not yet fully faded, did. Warren Petrakis didn't wait for anyone to come looking for him. On Monday morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual, made his own coffee in the small kitchen at the end of the corridor as he had done for 30 years, and by the time Nico entered his office, he was already seated in his chair, glasses resting on his nose, hands folded over his stomach. He looked at Nico and smiled, the smile of an old man watching the son of his friend walk through the door. He said the boy looked tired, that the boy should sleep more, and that he had said the same thing to his father for decades, without either of them ever listening. Nico pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without speaking. Petrakis removed his glasses and polished them, then said that he had been sitting in this room before Nico had even learned to read. He spoke of the rainy day at the cemetery, the day when a 22-year-old boy had stood frozen beside his father's grave, and Petrakis had been the man who stepped forward, took him by the shoulders, and led him back to the car. He said he wasn't telling that story because he wanted anything in return. He was telling it so the boy would remember that the chair he now occupied had been kept warm by men like him during all the years he had been away. Nico asked whether he intended to deny it. Petrakis placed his glasses on the desk. Then he said no, in the voice of a man who considered denial a waste of both their time. He said the structure had existed before that woman was ever hired by the company, that she hadn't created it but had merely been placed inside it, and that she suited the role because she had the kind of face newspapers wanted while he didn't. He said he had never taken much. He said a company of this size always needed an empty space, somewhere money could enter and leave without anyone having to account for every dollar, because without such a place, certain things would never get done. Nico asked whether his father had known. Petrakis looked at him for a long time. Then he said that his father had known. He had always known. He had simply never asked. And that was how we kept this house standing all those years, by letting each man do his dirty work in his own corner and making sure no one opened anyone else's cabinet. He didn't say it as a defense. He said it the way someone explained an obvious truth to a child who wasn't yet old enough to understand it. Nico sat in silence for a moment. Then he placed 3 things on the desk, one at a time. The first was a prepared letter of resignation, with only the signature line left blank. The second was a thick gray file bearing the name of the federal prosecutor's office on its cover. The third was an old photograph yellowed at the corners, showing 2 men standing in front of a warehouse. One of them Nico's father, the other Petrakis, both still young and both smiling. Petrakis looked at the photograph. Nico told him he could keep it. He said it was the only thing in that room Petrakis would be allowed to take with him. The name would remain there. Petrakis sat for a very long time, his aged hands resting on the desk, and at last he asked whether the boy understood that doing this would make the house smaller. Nico stood, fastened the button of his coat, and said that his father had kept the family intact by refusing to ask questions, while he intended to keep it intact by asking every one of them. Then, before leaving the room, he spoke his final words, saying that if the house became smaller because of that, then let it become smaller. That afternoon, Adele Whitmore brought a cardboard box into Nico's office from the family archives, the kind of box people used to store the papers of someone who had died and then never opened again. She set it on the desk and said she had been searching for several days, and that there was something he needed to see for himself. Inside was Rosaria Vasari's personal file, and beneath the final layer of papers lay the document from the year 2009, the paper she had signed in a language she couldn't read well. Nico had seen it once, many years earlier, and that time he had looked only at his mother's signature before folding it away. This time, he read everything. In the lower right corner, beneath the section reserved for the witness, there was a handwritten line in blue ink, the writing neat and slanted, giving the name and title of the person who had been present that day. Warren Petrakis, building manager. 17 years earlier, before he had become Nico's father's closest friend, back when he still inspected hallways and signed papers for the people who cleaned the floors. Nico sat for a very long time with one hand resting on the desk, while Adele stood beside the window and said nothing. Then he spoke very quietly, saying that she had cleaned floors for that man, that he had handed her that paper, and that a few years later he had stood at her funeral and shaken her husband's hand. During that same week, as the review team worked through every terminated contract, they stopped at one name: Denise Okonjo, a contract employee dismissed more than a year earlier after being accused of taking money, whose signature had been cut from an old document, whose reimbursement form had been created after she had already left the building. The person processing payroll that day had been Rhonda Pace. No one asked her about it. She wrote her own statement and submitted it, saying that she had seen the timestamp, had known it was wrong, and had remained silent for more than a year. She wrote that she hadn't saved Maeve Sullivan because she was brave, but because she couldn't bear to stand by and watch it happen one more time. The board suspended her for 3 months without pay and placed one condition on her return: that she personally deliver the letter correcting the record. Denise Okonjo now worked the night shift at a warehouse beyond the Beltway. Rhonda drove there on a Saturday afternoon, parked across the street, and stood before the steel door with the envelope in her hand for nearly 20 minutes without ringing the bell. Then she rang it. As for Maeve, Ezra couldn't reopen her father's case through the courts because the legal deadline had expired long ago. But the construction contractor from that year still had an agreement awaiting renewal with a company under Nico's control. And during the renewal meeting, only one condition was presented: that they issue a correction to the accident record, or there would be no renewal. The first draft stated that there wasn't enough evidence to establish that the worker had violated safety procedures. Maeve read it once, pushed it back, and said that not enough evidence still left a stain, and people would still understand it however they wished. She told them to write exactly what had happened, that the safety training record from that day hadn't been signed by her father. The official correction was issued 3 weeks later. One morning in March, Maeve carried it to the cemetery, stood before the headstone, and read all 4 paragraphs aloud from beginning to end. There was no compensation. There was only a name restored to its rightful place. That spring, in the loading area behind the tower on West Wacker, a woman working the night shift slipped on the wet floor and fell into a sitting position, clutching her wrist. A young security guard who had only recently started working there ran outside. He looked toward the line of guest vehicles waiting to enter, then looked at the new procedure notice mounted beside the desk, then turned back and did 3 things in the exact order written there. He brought her a chair. He brought her a bottle of water. He called for medical assistance. There were no cameras there, no important person standing nearby to watch, and the following morning, not a single newspaper mentioned it. From the corridor on the floor above, Nico Vasari watched through the glass. He saw the chair being carried out. He didn't go downstairs. That evening, he stopped by Maeve's office while she was still reading a complaint file about vehicle fuel expenses, and he stood in the doorway and asked whether she would like to have dinner with him. Not for work. Maeve looked up, studied him for a moment, then said that he knew she would argue with him throughout the entire meal, didn't he? He said he was looking forward to it. This story leaves us with 3 things worth remembering. The first is that a person's dignity doesn't depend on who that person later turns out to be, because kindness offered only to hidden people of power isn't kindness at all. The second is that one act of compassion can save one person, but changing an entire system requires records, patience, and enough courage to ask who else has been harmed. The third is that the best workplace isn't the one with the brightest lobby or the wealthiest owner, but the one where an ordinary person can do the right thing without being crushed for it. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so that more people can hear stories like this every day. How do you feel about Maeve, about Manny, about Ophelia, and what would you have done if you had been standing in that lobby that morning? Please leave a comment below, because we sincerely want to hear what lies deep within your hearts. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.